Welcome again to Chess News. I've been away for, well, maybe a week or so. That has to do with the fact that I started a new job as a student coach. It took some of my attention away from, amongst other things, my chess blog. But anyway, I'm back here for Chess News number 32. And of course I want to take a look at one of the games that is played during the final Chess Masters in Bilbao. And to be precise, the game between Topalov and Magnus Carlsen. Another game in which the Sicilian dragon got slayed, and quite seriously, I might add. Okay, let's get right to the action. e4, c5, knight of 3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight of 6, knight c3, and now g6. This move is characteristic, of course, for the dragon. Now bishop e3 has been the main move for several decades. Bishop g7, and I might just note out for the guys among you that don't know this, black can make a mistake here. It looks very tempting to immediately attack the bishop on e3 with knight g4, but let me point out a little trap to you. Bishop b5 is more or less immediately winning for white. And that has to do with the fact that if black now defends the check with his bishop, he also pins his bishop, which means that white can safely take this piece here on g4. So that means that black's best move here is knight c6, but then of course after knight takes c6, b takes c, and bishop takes c6, white is winning material. Okay, after bishop e3 and bishop g7, black is threatening to play knight g4 because he has just vacated the f8 square for his king. So after knight g4 and bishop b5 check, black could simply move his king to f8 and have a nice game because of the attack on the bishop here on e3. Okay, so that's a little bit of trapping theory, Sicilian dragon trapping theory. So that explains why after bishop g7, f3 is the main move here. Now theory continues, knight c6, queen d2, and castles. And now one of the main moves, bishop c4. Castles queen side is a whole different chapter. So back to the main line. Bishop c4, which was played in the game, and now bishop d7. And only now white plays castle's queen side, and rook c8. Now this indirectly attacks the bishop on c4, which explains the retreat to b3. And now black plays knight e5. And usually this knight maneuver means that black will win the bishop pair, because either this bishop or this bishop will go after black has played knight c4, double attacking these two white pieces here. Now, I think the most theoretical and probably most researched move here is h4, which is a whole different chapter, as are many different lines in the dragon. But in this game, after knight e5, Topalov decides to play king b1, which is always a nice prophylactic move to play, you know. You just bring your king out of the vis-a-vis with the rook on c8. And now Magnus' his pet line lately, a6 was played here. And only now Topalov surges ahead with his h-pawn. And well, I suppose that many of you know the idea. Let me just point it out very quickly. White wants to open up the h-file in exchanging like this. Then his next move will be to try and exchange the bishops of the dark squares. Then he will try to get access to h6 for his queen. And then the king will have to move backwards to h8. And then, of course, supported by the rook here, queen h8 is checkmate. So that is very basically White's also very blunt attacking idea. Now this is a very serious, very concrete, and usually quite fast plan. And that means that black has to combine his own counterattack on the queen side and his defense on the king side in a very good way. Now, there is a move to stop white's attack for a moment, and that's the move that Magnus is playing. He plays here h5, just simply blocking, physically blocking the advance of white's h-pawn. But now another very typical move follows, and that is g4, with no other idea that if black takes the pawn, which Magnus does in fact, to again try and pry open the h-file with h5. Now, we can see in these kinds of positions that white doesn't really care about sacrificing one or two pawns. Because one rule to remember, one strategic chess rule, is that when you have opposite castle kings, it doesn't really matter who has the most material, but rather who has the quickest and the most swift and decisive attack. So that is why Topalov is trying to open as many files as possible on black's king side, so as to get quick access for a mating attack. Now, in this position, of course, black can make a mistake. Let's have a look at g takes f3, for instance. Why not, just taking another pawn? Well, this would allow white's h-pawn to wreak havoc immediately, like this, with h6. Then bishop h8 is forced, and now there is a check, like this. And if black takes it with the knight, then we can see this switch, queen h2, with mate to follow over the h file. So if after h7 check, king g7, which then appears to be better, there would follow bishop h6 check, king takes h7, and now not bishop takes f8, but bishop g7 check, because now the bishop also attacks the h8 square, which is important, as we shall see soon. Now the best defense is to interpose the knight, but queen h6, king g8, and queen takes h8 is mate. And now we see why it is handy for white's bishop to cover the h8 square rather than being on f8. Okay, after h5, black can make another mistake. We just looked at g takes f3 question mark, but knight takes f3 runs into similar problems after just a simple exchange on f3 like this, and again h6 with similar ideas as in the previous line. Well, this more or less explains why after h5 black is forced here to take this pawn on h5 with the knight. And now Topalov plays rook d g1. This is a very strong move because it puts the other rook on a semi-open file, and it prepares ideas like bishop h6, exchanging this important black squared bishop here on g7, and then trying, for instance, for rook takes h5, when after g takes h5, queen g5 would lead to very lethal checks, etc., etc. Now, you might ask, why instead of rook d g1 not f takes g4? Well, black is still quite strong on this g4 square. So when he recaptures with the knight, he not only attacks white's all-important black square bishop, but he also protects the h6 square, and I think that in this case he will have an okay game. So the way to go about it in this position after knight takes h5 really is rook d g1. Now we have reached a position that has been played before on top level this year. Earlier in Mainz, Carlsen played against another move, queen a5, And this move was also played in Karyakin Rajabov during the Grand Prix in Sochi. Now, in the game against Anand, Carlsen made a mistake, a terrible mistake later, and lost the game, but not due to Queen a5. And if my memory serves me correctly, Rajabov also played Queen a5, like mentioned, and even won with it against Karyakin. So you might expect Queen a5 to appear again here after Rook dg1, but in this particular game against Topalov, Magnus comes up with a novelty, and he plays Rook c5. And this move does contain a certain threat, because the move Rook c5 activates the rook along the 5th rank, and I will show you an illustrative variation soon. But what we shouldn't forget is that it is White's move now, and even though Rook c5 contains an idea, White can simply defuse this idea with his next move. Yeah. Okay, now for instance, let's insert a null move here to try and see what Black's idea is. So if White just passes up one move, we could for instance suggest G takes f3 in this position for Black. And then Rook takes h5 looks very strong, but in fact is losing for White, because after G takes h5 and Bishop h6, which puts some very serious pressure on this bishop on g7, Black can defend with knight g4, and White does not have the move Queen g5 at his disposal because of the simple Rook takes g5. So now we can see what one of the functions of the Rook on c5 is. Okay, but let's go back to the game, and I just want to point out to you another sideline. For instance, knight a4 would be interesting to look at because it attacks the rook, but of course this would be a blunder because of the bishop takes a4, and bishop takes a4, there no longer is a defender of the c4 square, and bishop c4 is winning in this case for Black. So back to normal play, Rook c5, and now it is Topalov's move, and with bishop h6 he simply diffuses Black's idea of taking on f3 on the next move. So he is still a step ahead, and in playing bishop h6 he's eliminating Black's most juicy and poisonous piece, the bishop on g7. And yeah, objectively speaking, you know, and when we look at the strategic pros and cons of a position such as the dragon, we normally know that this bishop is a very important defender of the Black king side, and also a very important attacker because it is aimed at White's queen side. But I think it's also, when you're playing the dragon, very important to kind of feel the character of the position. And this bishop on g7, even though we've just pointed out its functions, it really is Black's most juicy, venomous, poisonous piece. And once it gets exchanged, and this is particularly obvious in this game, it feels somehow like the dragon has been ripped out his tongue and can spit no fire anymore. So in a way, this bishop on g7 is what usually keeps the dragon alive, and once it is gone, it seems as though it has lost its soul. And this is what we will also see in the remainder of this game. Now let's have a look at a possible move for Black in this position. Knight f3, for instance, it would be a mistake because of knight takes f3, G takes f3, and Rook g6. We can see that this bishop is also still fulfilling some attacking purpose. Other possibilities would be, after bishop h6, g takes f3, but then bishop takes g7 would follow, king g7, and for instance rook h5. And this rook cannot be taken because of the follow-up queen g5 check with a mating attack. So that explains why after bishop h6, Magnus is playing a move that looks like loss of a tempo, but is actually forcing matters. He plays here king h7, double attacking the bishop on h6, and also moving his king out of the diagonal a2 to g8, so out of the sphere of influence from the bishop on b3. Now this means that Topalov is now forced to exchange the bishops, but after king g7 he finds a very strong follow-up. Being 2 pawns down, he doesn't really care about the pawn on g4, but simply chases away one of black's most important and centralized piece, the knight on e5. He plays here f4. Now the knight jumps into c4, and after bishop takes c4, we can see now that rook c4 is of course forced, because otherwise black would lose a piece. But this also makes you wonder, you know, black has moved the rook to c5 only to move it again to recapture on c4. So we can ask ourselves the question, is rook c5 really a useful move, or does it just simply lose a tempo? I mean, it is useful in the sense that black is threatening g takes f3 after rook c5, but we've just seen that because it is white's turn after that, with bishop h6 he simply diffuses this idea, and then has the follow-up with f3, f4, you know, just forcing the knight to c4, and then the rook is only on c5 to recapture the piece on c4. And it's a bit of a lone ranger out there on c4, you know, and it cannot win the war just by itself on the queen side. So, yeah, we can now slowly start to see all the cons rather than the pros of this typical dragon position. So Topalov now continues with f5, a very strong move, preparing queen g5, which would pin the g pawn and threaten to take the knight on h5. Okay, nothing is lost yet for Carlsen. He plays here e5, opening up the diagonal from d8 to g5, and also simultaneously attacking the white knight on d4. Now this knight moves out of the way, knight d e2, and Carlsen continues now with rook h8. And usually we like the dragon because black is attacking on the queen side, but because of the absence of the bishop of the black squares and the fact that black's pieces are not really coordinating well, he at the moment is restricting himself to the defense of his own weakened king side. Now there was a possibility here for Topalov to go a little bit astray. In this position he could have taken the pawn on d6, you know, just trying to regain the sacrificed material. But it would mean that he would be distracted from his attack on the king side. Because after bishop c6, which attacks both the queen and the weakness on e4, queen takes e5, queen f6, queen takes f6, knight takes f6, would actually be okay for black. Now usually endgames are quite okay for black in dragon positions, and I suppose this position is no exception to that rule. He has a very nice strong bishop on c6, which is looking all the way to h1 at the moment, if I count correctly. Well, he's not a pawn up, but his pieces are much more active now, and his king is also no longer in danger. So this would be a nice variation to get away with it, you know, for black. There was another option, instead of queen takes d6, which would not have been so good, but an option to try and prepare queen takes d6 and strive for a better version. That would be f takes g6, because after f takes g6, the e6 square in black's camp has been weakened. Now, if now queen takes d6 and bishop c6, there would follow queen e6, which is now possible because there is no longer a pawn on f7. And we can see now that white is double attacking the rook on c4 and the pawn on g4. And after a move such as, let's just say queen c5 to bring the rook out of harm's way, queen takes g4 would be very strong, threatening to take on g6 or even on h5 with the rook. So in this position, white would be winning. Okay, but after rook h8, Topalov didn't play rook d6, sorry, queen takes d6, but also not f takes g6. No, he continued here with his sole focus on the king side, and he plays here b3. Now, yeah, well, this is an interesting move. I mean, it attacks the rook, so in that sense it keeps the initiative. But probably f takes g6 would have offered him a little bit better chances, because now Magnus had an opportunity to try and stabilize his defense with rook c8. But unfortunately for him, he didn't play this in the game. Now, if we continue rook c8 as in the game, then we can see why rook c8 would have been a nice move for Magnus to play. So we just continue with the game moves, only with the difference that now the rook is on c8. Rook takes g4, knight f6, rook g goes back to g1, and now the all-important point of the rook being on c8, namely queen e7, protecting the d6 square. And this is only possible because now the rook on c8 is protecting the rook on h8. And if we now return to the game, we can see that the move that Magnus played is a bit weaker. So back to b3, where Magnus played rook c6. And now Topalov played rook takes g4. Knight f6 was played, attacking the rook. Also the one on h1, by the way. And then rook g1. And we can see now that in this case, queen e7 would be losing, because in this case, after rook takes h8, black's king is forced to recapture the rook in the corner, thereby giving up his control over the h6 square and the h file. And after a move such as knight d5, queen h6 check, king g8, and f takes g6, white is just simply winning here. So, if I have a suggestion, I think that maybe 23 rook c8 would have been a better continuation than rook c6. Now, let's go back to this game move and repeat a few of the same moves we just saw. Rook takes g4, knight f6, rook g1. We just pointed out that queen e7 is not possible here. But what Magnus played also surprised me. I think that the better options in this position would be still to play rook c8 and then try for queen e7, or queen f8, for instance, trying to protect the d6 pawn, but also trying keeping a defense of the rook on h8. What Magnus played in this position was rook takes h1. And now, even though this move does not lose immediately, I think that he is in real trouble, for the simple reason that after rook takes h1, he just simply has given up his control of the h-file. And white is now threatening queen h6 immediately. And, oops, there is really only one move now. And it is knight g4 to try and protect the h6 square. Okay, in the process, black is threatening now to take the pawn on f5, which explains Topalov's next move, namely knight g3. But he's already preparing knight d5 with such ideas as f5, f6, which would lure the knight away from g4, when the square on h6 would become available again. So in this position white really has very serious pressure, and I think it has to do with this rook c6 move and also this rook h8 takes h1 move, giving up the h file. Okay, so now it's all hands on deck for Magnus. He tries and defend himself with king g8, just sidestepping any future checks on g5. Let's note for a minute that another try, such as g5, to try and block this diagonal towards h6, would fail because of knight d5 still threatening f6, when the pawn on g5 would be very vulnerable. And f7, f6 in this case would also not be a very good idea. Let's just execute that move because of knight h5 check looking very strong, and king f7 is followed by a very strong destructional sacrifice, knight f6. And after a move like, for instance, knight takes f6, white just simply crashes through here with queen takes g5. There is no defense, and even though black is material up, you can quite simply see why this attack is winning, because white is attacking here with knight, pawn, queen and rook, which is 19 points, so to say, and black is only defending with queen, bishop and knight, which is 16 points, which means that there is a numerical majority for white on the king side, because we can safely discard this rook. It's just only looking against his own pawn, so it's 5 points doing nothing, just sitting out there on the c6 square. So that is, you could say, the general reason why such an attack is usually very strong. Okay, let's return back to the game, where after knight g3 king g8 was played, and where Topalov must have felt very happy to be able to play knight d5. What an octopus that is. Okay, now this knight is becoming really very threatening, so Magnus plays here rook c5 with no other idea than to just eliminate this beast on d5. And we can see again that this rook is not really leading a very happy life now, is it? I mean, it moved from a8 to c8, to c5 to c4, and back to c6, and then to c5, and yeah, I mean, it's just like cat and mouse this time. Anyway, Topalov had a very technical win here, and he could start here, for instance, with b4, attacking the rook, but the rook wanted to sacrifice itself anyway on d5. But we can imagine, of course, that after queen d5, white has a technically winning position because of the fact that he is up material. But Topalov wouldn't be Topalov if he didn't play for the full-out attack and discarded this technical option. Of course, in this position he played here knight e3, attacking the most important defender of black's king side, and to be more precise, the h6 square. Now for the moment black can take the white knight, but after queen takes e3 he must rush over to the king side to try and protect as many black squares as possible. And he does so in playing queen f6. And he just has got the h8 square covered. So when queen h6 is coming, queen h8 no longer is a mating threat. Okay, now here comes an interesting moment. Is white's 31st move, and I suppose they were already in some time trouble. And the next move that Topalov plays has been criticized here and there by commentators. He plays queen h6, but actually it's not such a bad move. Now this criticism probably had to do with the fact that white could go here into a winning endgame, not playing queen h6, but rather rook h6, reserving the g5 square for the queen. Because in this case, knight h5 is threatened, which means that black's best move here is queen g7. But then after the subsequent queen g5, f6, queen takes g6, regaining the first pawn, and queen takes g6, rook takes g6, check, king f7, knight h5, the f6 pawn will fall. Now, the fact that Topalov didn't play this move probably has to do with flexibility. I think that he saw this line, but going into an endgame when you're on the attack is difficult, especially since endgames tend to have longer variations and demand strong evaluating skills, which is very difficult, of course, to do correctly in time trouble. Because it is also quite possible that Topalov saw that black can now play bishop c6, and hey, is he getting some kind of counterplay against my weak e4 pawn? Geez, can I win this position? Oh dear, my time is running out. What should I play? Should I play this endgame line? Or should I just try and keep the pressure on black in not playing rook h6, but queen h6? I think it's quite possible that this sort of train of thoughts ran through Topalov's mind. Sorry. And, well, it is true that rook takes f6, king e7, rook e6, king f7, knight f6 defends the e4 pawn, but it's also quite possible that Topalov didn't see this far. Of course, this is a winning endgame, but queen h6 is still fine, keeping up the pressure on black. Okay, now Carlsen defended his position with queen g7. Still, the threat was knight h5, just as after rook h6, the same threat. And in this case, it seems that Topalov also didn't play the best move. The best move was probably here to play queen d2, immediately attacking the d6 pawn, but also toying with the idea of going queen a5 and queen d8, as we shall see later in the game. And after queen d2, probably rook c6 would be the best move, but then white can continue his attack with rook g1. Okay, but Topalov after queen g7 played queen g5. And only after f6 he went to d2. Now, this is a moment to stop and pause. Because if I ask you, which side would you rather play with? Which queen do you prefer? Then, given the colors, I suppose you would immediately answer, I want to play with white. Just look at his queen. It is much more active than black's. So, both sides have a queen, but the strength of this piece is relative to the movement possibilities it has. And of course we can see that black's queen has very limited movement and white's has all kinds of switches. Okay, so very nice to see. This also explains, of course, why it is possible for white to be better in such a position even when he's a pawn down. Because, you know, this being a pawn down is very strongly compensated by the fact that white's queen is worth much more at this moment than her counterpart. Okay, queen d2 was played, and now g5 maybe was possible, but then white could continue knight h5, and after queen e7, protecting both weak pawns, queen h2 would be very strong, threatening again a sacrifice of the knight on f6. Okay, so after queen d2, rook c6 was what Magnus played. And now Topalov has been playing quite well so far, but plays a bad move now, giving away most of the advantage. King b2. As he admitted later after the game, he didn't immediately see the idea of queen a5, which wins immediately because of the threat of queen d8 check, attacking both bishop and king. Now, black of course could try and protect against the threat with b6, which is probably the best move, but then after queen takes a6, rook c8, protecting the back rank, and queen b7 for instance, black is in dire straits and is losing. So king b2 was a bad move in the sense that it gave away most of the advantage and missed an immediate win with queen a5. So back to the game, king b2. But now it is Magnus' turn to miss the best defense. He could have stabilized his position with bishop e8. Now I indicated a few yellow arrows here, because the trick of this move is that it blocks the back rank, thereby taking the venom out of any queen d8, which no longer would be with check. Also, and probably this is the most important factor, it opens up the 7th rank for black's queen towards c7 for instance, because if now queen a5, black could simply play queen c7 and deny white's queen access to d8. And furthermore, after bishop e8, we can see another point, for instance, after f takes g6, when black can play bishop takes g6, also protecting here the h5 square, which means that this guy can no longer go here and cause difficulties for black. So in this position, probably white's best try would be to play knight f5, but then of course black can eliminate this strong attacker. E takes e5, and after king takes f8, I think black has chances to survive. His position was never better than at the moment. Okay, so, but unfortunately the bad move king b2 was answered with the rather suboptimal g takes f5, where bishop e8 would have been a good chance, because now Topalov seized his opportunity, saw queen a5, and now played this idea. Now, this move abandons the knight on g3, but Topalov has seen correctly that black cannot take it because of queen d8 check, king g7, and now the following mating attack. I will just execute the moves. King f7, rook h7, queen g7, rook g7, and it's winning of course now king e6, queen g8 check move. But after queen a5, the best defense, or at least the most tenacious, would have been b6. But again, Magnus, also in time trouble, plays suboptimally. After queen a5, he plays here queen e7. Now the strongest move here, if I'm correct, was knight takes e5, attacking the queen, because after bishop takes f5 and e takes f5, white still has a very strong attack here, because of the check on d5, the switch to g2, and also the direct availability of white's rook on the king side. I think this position is still winning quite convincingly for white. But instead of that, after queen e7, Topalov plays suboptimally here with queen d5 check. And now black could play bishop e6. And it's quite amazing what these guys see in time trouble, because it looks quite nice now to play here knight takes f5 with a small tactical trick. Of course, the trick is here bishop takes d5, which would be a blunder, because white has the in-between check, knight takes e7, king f8, and would be a piece up after knight takes d5, simply winning. But after bishop e6, knight f5, black would play an in-between move. Rook takes c2, check. And now this is a very dangerous desperado, because white cannot take it. Because then black would move his queen out of harm's way with check, namely queen c7 check. And after king b2, it's white's queen that's lost. Bishop takes d5. So after rook takes c2 check, it is best for white to simply move his king away, for instance to a3. But then after queen d7, when white is 2 pawns down, even though he still has a strong position, his queen is still attacked. And after queen d3, probably it would be nice to try and hold the position with black with bishop takes f5, sacrificing the rook here, but at least eliminating this strong knight on f5, and after bishop g6 trying to set up some kind of fortress. The thing here is that white may still have some attacking chances, quite serious attacking chances, but there is not so much attacking potential anymore. Some pieces have been exchanged, and black is still 2 important pawns up, and also the pawn on e4 is weak. And, you know, white's king is also no longer the beauty it used to be, sitting on b2 with the extra defensive pawn on c2. Okay, well, that was a long story explaining why after bishop e6, knight f5 is probably not the strongest, and also the reason why Topalov, being very much up to the task on this moment, played queen d1 with the idea of switching to h5 and starting a resistible mating attack from that side. Okay, so Magnus of course now felt forced to protect some entry squares on the king side, and now e takes f5 followed. Of course, queen g3 is not not possible right now because of rook g1 winning the queen. But since white has now recaptured on f5 and is attacking the bishop, the move knight e4 has now become possible. So he has vacated now the g file and is threatening rook g1, which explains Magnus's king f8. And now white is crushing through here with knight takes d6. Material is even now, but we can still see that there is hardly any serious coordination between black's pieces, and he's just in a terrible storm here. Now some commentators noted that bishop g8 would have put up some token resistance. And I suppose that is true, even though white's position remains winning after a simple retreat like knight e4, for instance, preparing queen d8 check. Just an idea. But after knight takes c6, Magnus played here king e7, allowing an even stronger finish for Topalov. Knight b7 was played now, threatening an immediate mate with queen d8. So queen g8 was now played to protect d8, and Topalov could have tried now the beautiful rook h7. Of course this rook cannot be taken because of queen d8 mate again, and if it cannot be taken, then of course it means that it enters the 7th rank with tremendous strength, attacking the bishop and behind it the king. This is a simple winning attack for white. But rather than playing rook h7, which would have been the most beautiful finish, after queen g8, Topalov played queen d2. Also with numerous winning ideas, such as doubling up on the d file, or giving a deadly check on b4. And this explains why Magnus played rook b6, protecting the b4 square so that no check is possible. But now of course rook d1, doubling up. Threatening well, you name it. Queen d7 amongst others. So this is playing queen c8, which overprotects a few squares on the center of the board. Most importantly d7. And now, again, Topalov misses the strongest opportunity. The strongest move would have been to play knight d8, leaving white control over the d7 square also, I should point out, and threatening knight takes f7 followed by the check on d5. This would have been a winning position. But rather than play knight d8, Topalov played here knight d6. And just for the moment, he is allowing black access to the d file, because he is blocking his own influence square, his own sphere of influence, I want to say, over d7 and d8. So Magnus now plays queen d7. But unfortunately for him, it is just not enough, because the remaining rook endgame after knight takes f7, queen takes c2, rook takes d2, king takes f7, c4, king e7, and king c3 is losing for him. So in this position Magnus resigned, and we can quite easily see why. All of white's pieces are powerhouses. The rook on d2 is controlling the d file. If necessary, it can switch to the king side and harass the king from here over the 7th rank. Also, white's king on c3 is a powerhouse. It's very nicely centralized. It's supporting the march of the extra pawns on the queen side, and soon white will have two connected passed pawns there. And the only thing that black can put in the balance is this meager pawn here on e5. But as soon as it wants to go forward, it's already more or less lost. Just imagine that this pawn would move forward at this moment. White would simply play a rook e2, and it already can no longer be defended. So we can see now why this is quite a simple winning rook endgame for white. So that ends our discussion of this Sicilian dragon. I think, to summarize, it was quite a characteristic game for playing the dragon with white and black. This game was not a very good result for the black players. Yeah, just to go back to this moment, where the bishop from g7 was exchanged. From that moment on, we could kind of sense that there was no longer any life in black's position, even though he could have defended better, and just try to keep his game together. But the queen was always in dubio. Should I attack on the queen side? Should I join my rook in the attack on the queen side? Or should I just keep an eye on my fellow rook on h8? Or should I just go to f6 and g7, etc. and try and protect my monarch? And, this bishop on d7. So, okay, it was preventing any knight a4 moves, but white was never going to play knight a4. And it also never was in time to move itself to c6 because the rook was in the way, or to move itself to e6 because white was overprotecting the e6 square, because normally from e6 it would protect the d5 square, so it could exchange itself for any white knight appearing on d5. And then this other knight here on h5, it was just on the edge of the board, and yeah. So, yeah, a very typical game, not a very good game for black. And if we want to revive, I suppose that's a good word. If we want to revive the dragon, I think black players will start looking for improvements at this point in time, where after rook d, g1, Magnus played rook c5 in this line. But it didn't really seem to have any serious point. Maybe black players will start with Queen A5 again and look for improvements there. Okay, well, I hope you've learned something from this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know I did, certainly. Thank you for watching, and please, until next time. Bye-bye.